The case study, research questions, and the case. The case study is an in-depth analysis of a bounded system. Yin points out that case studies are the preferred strategy when how and why questions are posed. While quantitative research uses numbers as data, qualitative uses words as data. Denson and Lincoln explain that qualitative research is a situation activity that locates the observer in the world. Qualitative research consists of a set of interpretive materials practiced that make the world visible. Qualitative researchers study things in their natural settings, attempting to make sense of phenomena in terms of the meanings people bring to them. Qualitative research is an umbrella term covering an array of interpretive techniques which seek to describe, decode, translate, and otherwise give the meaning with meaning, not the frequency, of certain more or less naturally occurring phenomena in the social world. Basically, qualitative researchers are interested in understanding how people make sense of experiences. The researcher is the primary instrument for data collection and analysis, and words rather than numbers are used to convey what the researcher has learned about a phenomenon. And I wish I could give you steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 on how to write a case study. But that's not how research works. You will research on how to do research. You will triangle resources to find the methodology that works best for you in your study. You will support your writing with sources. I'll give you some of my favorites in this presentation, and I will give you a contrasting viewpoint a bit later. Then you can research other viewpoints on the case study for your own. Just remember to support your research with sources in your writing. So I can't give you steps 1, 2, 3, and 4, but I can give you some of my favorite sources to get you started. And Yin is one of them. Yin suggests 5 components: the research question, its proposition, its units of analysis, a determination of how the data are linked to the propositions, and criteria to interpret the findings. Let's begin with the case study research question. Case study research generally answers one or more questions that begin with how or why. The questions are targeted to a limited number of events or conditions and their interrelationships. And to assist you in targeting and formulating the questions, I recommend a literature review. Take your topics or possible topics and visit the University of Cumberland's online library. Research journals. Look for your topics. What kind of research has already been done? What kind of case studies have already been done? You want your case study to be contemporary and to advance the research in the field. Yin suggests 3 stages. First of all, try to use literature to narrow your interest to a key topic or two, not worrying about any specific questions. Then, examine closely a few key studies on your topic of interest. Identify the research questions in those studies and whether they conclude with new questions or loose ends for future research. This may stimulate your own thinking and imagination, and you might find yourself articulating some potential research questions of your own. Then, in the 3rd stage, examine another set of studies on the same topic. This may reinforce the relevance of your potential research questions or suggest more ways of sharpening your questions. And you will need data for your research question. You may want to interview people, review documents, records, websites, or conduct field observations, and be sure to choose a question that will give you an opportunity to be able to find some form of data. The proposition. A proposition is optional, but it can help you narrow the scope of your study. You can propose an assumption based upon your knowledge or literature review. And let's take an example from Yin. Suppose your topic is interorganizational partnerships. Let's say we have a question. How do organizations collaborate with one another to provide joint services? How do organizations collaborate with one another to provide joint services? So maybe a manufacturer and a retail outlet collaborate to sell computer products. So this question is quite broad, but you have a proposition, you have a theory, a purpose behind your study, an idea on your own based upon your own experience or your literature review that you think they collaborate because they derive mutual benefit. This proposition, besides reflecting an important theoretical issue, also begins to tell you how to look for relevant evidence. So it gives you a direction in your data collection. Next is the unit of analysis. This is also called the phenomenon, and it's also called the case. And this is a person, an organization, a behavioral condition, an event, or some other social phenomenon. Again, it can be a person, an organization, a behavioral condition, an event, or other social phenomenon. So your case or your unit of analysis might be an individual. It could be a group of individuals such as IT students. It might be a group of teachers, a group of patients, a group of leaders. It could be families, a department such as an IT department, a group of departments, an organization, a company. It could be a program such as disaster relief efforts or a group of programs. It could be projects such as ERP implementation, a movement such as the growth of big data. Keeping in mind it's a bounded case, also called a unit of analysis or a phenomenon. Now we will cover data more later, but it's helpful to think of it now as you define your research question and case, because data is necessary in your case study. So some ideas on the type of data required in a case study. It could be a direct observation, looking at human actions, or looking at a physical environment. It could be interviews, open-ended conversations with a participant. It could be archival records, employee records, organizational charts, maps, survey data that's already been collected, documents, newspaper articles, letters, emails, reports, court reports, website data, job descriptions. You could observe participants, physical artifacts such as computer downloads, employees' work. And ideally, you will find two sources of data. I recommend that you create a case study database early to store and organize the data that you find. And maintain a chain of evidence. Where did you find the data? Who found the data? And add notes and narratives to remember how you thought you might use that data. And the fifth step of Yin is to interpret the data. You'll analyze the data and write your report. And again, more on this later. So to review the components according to Yin, the case study design must have the research question, its propositions, its unit of analysis, the person, organization, behavioral condition, event, or other social phenomenon, a determination of how the data is linked to the proposition, and then criteria to interpret the finding. A case study is an empirical inquiry that investigates a contemporary phenomena in depth and within its real-life context, especially when the boundaries between phenomena and context are not clearly evident. In other words, when you use the case study, you want to understand a real-life phenomenon in depth. I want to give you an alternative option of the case study by Professor Gibbs.
Okay, so case studies, as I said, one of the three major strategies along with surveys and experiments. What is a case study? Well, I'm going to borrow this definition from Colin Robson's book. A case study is a strategy for doing research, notice the strategy coming out here, involves an empirical investigation of a particular contemporary phenomenon within its real-life context using multiple sources of evidence. So let me just go back to some of those terms in turn. A particular contemporary phenomenon. So it's particular suggests there's one of them, although that's not always the case. It might be several, whatever it is, units, cases in a case study. It isn't always one case study. Sometimes it is, but can be several, and I'll talk about that in a later slide. Some of the issues around how you choose the cases and what they mean in relation to each other. Contemporary phenomenon, and I think the word here, the important word here is the phenomenon. It's a very general term, a phenomenon, so it means it's something that's going on, and that phenomenon can be a person, and often is a person, but it can be lots of other things too, other social phenomena, like organisations or events or places and so on. So it's some phenomenon, it's something happening or somebody doing something or some group of people doing something that you're studying. And of course it's contemporary, it's happening now, so you're studying it now. It's not a historical approach. Although of course I'm sure historians do use case studies as well. Next, you do it within its real life context. And that's another key point I think about case studies, is the contextual aspect of it. That you're doing it in its context. I think the biggest contrast there is with experiments, where you tend to do experiments in the lab. You tend to bring people in to your research institution, your university or whatever, as volunteers to work in your experiment, and often in the lab or some similar office or room to work in. In the case of case studies, it's very much a case of going out to wherever the phenomenon is. So wherever the people are, wherever the event is happening, wherever the institution is, you go out there and you study it in its context. And in its context means also you bring into account all the contextual factors, the fact that it's operating, or those people are operating in a wider world with things going on, things happening, things affecting them, they're affecting other things and so on. So all those kind of relationships are part of the context. And lastly, using multiple sources of evidence, and typically a case study, as I said, it's most common in the qualitative field. So it's very much associated with a lot of the qualitative approaches, such as interviews, observations, including particularly participant observation, ethnography. But it can be other sources too, and probably the other major one that's used in case studies is documents. So if you're going into an organisation, you would typically talk to people, observe them doing the things they're doing, and perhaps collect the documents that they are keeping about their activities in that organisation. So work in, for example, in commercial organisations, in a factory or an office, is a typical case study approach. You choose one site to do your work, that's the case. And then you collect information by talking to employees and collecting the data that they're keeping about their activities, their minutes of meetings, and their other guidance documents they use. And of course you observe them doing what they're doing. Okay, to go through the next few points, the case study may be descriptive, exploratory, or explanatory. Actually, most research strategies can be this. I talked very briefly about this last week with surveys. Surveys tend to be descriptive, but they can, if you ask the right kind of questions, be exploratory and even explanatory. The same is true of case studies. I mean, they are probably most well known for a kind of, I guess, an exploratory approach to things, the second one down here, where you're exploring an area. And in fact, the reason why people often use case studies is because not enough is known about the area to use any other kind of technique. You can't design a questionnaire unless you know what questions to ask. You can't design an experiment unless you know basically how people are going to respond within certain bounds to your experimental manipulations. But in the case of a case study, you can go in knowing almost nothing about what's going on and just start asking questions, observe things and so on. So it's a very open technique and very fits in very well with the kind of exploratory approach to data collection. But it can also be descriptive. Of course, you're writing up what you see there, so you're describing the situation. And also it can be explanatory in the sense that you begin to understand why things are happening and therefore can explain them. So it may be not as powerful as an experiment, and when I come to that in a couple of weeks' time, you'll see experiments are probably the most powerful way of making judgments about causation and giving explanations for things. But so can case studies do that as well. Case studies can help you understand why people do certain things, what motivates them, how they explain what they're doing, and what kind of preceding activities lead them to do certain kinds of things. And in that sense, therefore, you're explaining what's going on as well. So all of these things come into account, although, as I say, I mean, exploration, finding out what's there in the first place, if you know nothing, is probably the primary motivation for a case study. And notice also it's focused on these two things: process, how was it done? And that, of course, fits in very nicely with the exploratory question: what's going on here? Who's doing what to whom? How are they doing it, and so on. And the outcome as well. It can be used in a much more kind of evaluative sense. A case study can focus on whether something worked. If something's been changed, something's happened to people, or some event happens to them, then you can ask the questions of what was the outcome, what happened as a result of that thing going on. So, I mean, to give you a simple example of how that might fit in with a case study, you might do a case study of an election. And of course, in the election, you're asking, how do people operate? How do they campaign? How do they support their politicians? How do they get the vote out if it's that's an important aspect of what they're doing? Just think about the presidential elections at the moment. How do the TV debates go on and so on? All those kind of things. Asking the first question, the process questions: how was it done? But of course, it's an election, so you can also ask, what was the outcome? Who won, why did they win, how did they get the vote out, what kind of people voted, and so on and so forth. All those kinds of, questions about the outcome of the work as well. So a typical case study of, in that case, say, an election. Okay, so that's in outline what we're focusing on the case study. Let's look at a bit more detail of these things. First of all, let me look at some classic examples of case studies, and just to show you really two things here. One is the range of different kinds of things, and I'll talk a bit more about that in later slides, but also to talk, to give you some idea of the enormous kind of field that this covers. It is a big range of studies. Just to start with, one of the real classics, the individual case study. And this study, I've mentioned here the Jack Roller. This was a study done by Stanley of it's in an American situation. It was in an American town back in, I think, I've actually forgotten the date now, but I think it was in the 1930s the study was actually done. So it is really a classic from a very long time ago. And the Jack Roller was a particular character whom he researched. That was one of the terms used for this kind of guy, who was a bit of a con man, kind of artist, the study kind of looked at him, his life, one single person case study. So the individual case study, and it became a classic in talking about the life of somebody on the margins in American society. You can also have sets of case studies, individual case studies, and I mean, just as an example of this, I don't think this has actually been carried out, but 3 general practices you might study. So if you're looking at the health service and you want to look at some of the changes, particularly now with the big changes going on in the role of general practitioners in the health service, you might do a contrast of 3 different general practices. So looking at 3 single practices. Notice here the practice is the case, the practice is the group of doctors and all the other ancillary workers, the nurses and the receptionists and so on, who work together to do the work of the practice. And you might compare 3 individual practices that way, perhaps picking a very large one, a very small one, or one out in the countryside and one in a town and one in the suburbs and so on, to get a range of different cases. I'll talk more about that kind of procedure of how you pick separate cases in a later slide. Going a bit further there, another classic area of case studies has been the community studies approach, where there are loads of people involved, lots and lots of participants, whole communities, may even be thousands of people involved, but it's one community, it's picked upon for some particular reason. And just to give you 2 very diverse examples here, there's a classic study done back in the 1950s, originally went into the 60s I think, on family and kinship in East London, where the researchers, sociologists doing the work picked an area of East London, a fairly poor district of East London, and they basically did a very intensive case study with the people living there, and they stayed there, they interviewed them, they recorded what was going on, they observed them, they of course kept documents that were being kept about the local authority, by the local authority and so on. So they've got a range of different data coming in, and talked about the kind of life of effectively a working class community in Britain just after the Second World War. By contrast, an earlier study done just before the Second World War, the Azandi in the Sudan, was a similar kind of approach, but this time done by an anthropologist. In fact, it was Evans Pritchard, a very famous British anthropologist, working with the Azandi, which I think is now, if I'm right in saying, is an area which is now in South Sudan. It's the new country in Africa. He was working there when it was still a British colony, of course, back in the pre-war period, pre-Second World War period. He basically lived with the group of people called the Azandi, who spoke similar language. That's why they were called the Azandi. Actually, no, I think it's the Azandis on the border between South Sudan and Congo. That's where it's cited. So he might have been in the Congo some of the time as well. And he worked with them for several years and wrote a classic study about their beliefs, about their ideas and so on. Particularly, he was fascinated by their notions of magic and witchcraft and so on, what role that had in their life. So, 2 community studies, one anthropological and one based in the UK, and a much more kind of sociological approach to things, but using similar techniques of observation and so on. There have been other studies looking at social groups. So rather than defining it by a place, the town in the case of the East London study, or the villages and the area in the case of the Azandi study, in this case, the definition of the case is by virtue of some kind of social phenomenon. And in this case, I've chosen as an example Hal Becker's study of marijuana smokers. And again, it's quite an old study, going right back to the 1950s and 60s period. But he basically chose just a few people who were regular smokers of marijuana or hash or whatever they called it, and were also musicians, and the things were tied up together. Being musicians was tied up with drug taking and so on amongst that group of people. So a small group of people defined by their social position of being musicians and drug takers, and looked at how their lives were led, how their drug taking basically was part of their musical life and so on. It's a study that came up with the idea that you have to learn how to appreciate the effect of drugs and things like this. That in fact just taking drugs isn't good enough. You're having to learn certain things with it as well. Going further to the larger scale, we can define actual organisations, institutions. I've already mentioned the idea of studying an election. You could say the political parties involved, for example. But in these cases, these are studies of particular organisations. In one case, working for Ford, it was a car factory. Hugh Benyon study of that. We actually went to live and work inside the factory and worked with the workers in the factory, worked alongside them, observed them, and of course talked to them and so on, in that typical anthropological fashion, ethnographic fashion. In contrast, Nigel Fielding, I think it was his PhD study, so many years ago now, about 30 years ago, studied the National Front. And what he did was actually, as a postgraduate researcher, quite a dangerous and quite a brave thing to do, I think. He actually joined in the National Front. He actually went along to meetings and activities with them and talked to them, of course, to find out what they thought. A real insight into what the National Front is a far-right organisation, or it was then. I think it's now defunct, been taken over by other far-right organisations, but a kind of a fascist-type organisation in British politics. Quite a dangerous thing to do, to get involved in that, particularly with the kind of things he came out and published later on. He wasn't sympathetic, I have to say, to them. So quite an interesting...
Did he do that sort of undercover, or did they know that he was doing that?
I think it was partly undercover and partly not. I think some people they knew that he was a researcher, but a lot of them didn't know. It wasn't he didn't kind of wear it on his... Well, I don't know about echelons, but maybe some people knew where he was from and what his background was, but not everybody did. And I'm actually not sure. You're right. In some cases, it's done that way. You get permission at the top, but those lower down don't know. But I'm not sure he did that. It might have been he had certain neighbours of his or something knew it and knew his background, but actually maybe other people in the higher echelons didn't know what was going on. There certainly was a big fuss after he published his results that the National Front weren't at all pleased about the results. And then last example, some events as cases. In this case, I've given two things. I suppose I'm not even sure really whether housewife is an event as such. It's a role, isn't it, really, rather than an event, but other kinds of things, roles and relationships. Anne Oakley's study of called Housewife, the book she published, was a study of what it was like to be a housewife. And it was a very important study in suddenly bringing open an area that hadn't been studied before by sociologists, and of course was accounting for probably close to half the population's experience of life, what it was like to be a housewife. The Cuban Missile Crisis, there have been lots of studies of this, but another big event in this case, one single thing, in fact there was a lot in the media recently about this because it was an anniversary a week or so ago of the crisis itself, when the Soviet Union positioned some nuclear weapons in Cuba, and the Americans got very upset about that and wanted them to withdraw them. And for a time it was on the nuclear brink, so to speak, as to whether the United States and the Soviet Union would actually fire weapons at each other. So a huge crisis in international politics, and there's been a lot of studies about that and what happened as a case study. And of course you can look at that by looking at what the actors did, what they said, what they wrote, and what TV programs they made, and so on. So enormous amounts of data you can use to bring into that case study. Okay, so what I've tried to do here then is to give you some idea of the range of case study approaches. So a bit about how they collected the data. So you can see that it's definitely this kind of holistic approach to research, of bringing in things from various sources and looking at things in their context. And that all of them have in common this notion of defining what a case is, and that's an issue we'll come back to later on.
So where do you go from here? From here, visit your group discussion board and start talking with your team members about what you have in common and your common interests. Review your textbook on information governance. What topics intrigue you? And start your research. Visit the online library and start looking at the topics and find current research studies and case studies. At that point, you're ready to start building your research questions.